History is not written only by the things we can see. It is carved by the movements that happen underneath the surface, the choices no one recorded, the encounters with no witnesses, the moments so quick that even the most dedicated historians never had a chance to catch them. Every empire that falls, every path that is chosen, every war that ignites, all of them carry another layer of motion, thin as a breath, quiet but powerful enough to turn the course of history. Sometimes it is just a nod, a door pulled almost closed, a letter that is never found, and the world shifts to a different orbit. Not because someone is trying to hide the truth, but because some things exist only in a thread-thin instant. And if we blink, they vanish as if they were never there. Tonight, in this bedtime history episode, we step right into that in-between space, the place where the light is not strong enough to reveal everything, and the darkness is not deep enough to swallow the story whole. A slow, quiet stretch of time where history is not told through pages, but through a heartbeat. The heartbeat of small circles, hidden communities, and discrete decisions that guided humanity across thousands of years. So take a breath, settle in. Because sometimes if we listen in the exact right moment, the world reveals a shape we have never seen before. When we look back at the earliest civilizations, we tend to picture pyramids rising out of golden sand, irrigation canals slicing through desert plains, or stone gods carved so deeply into time that they seem untouched by decay. But beneath those monumental works, another kind of structure lived quietly, more delicate, softer than evening light, and often overlooked. These were groups of people entrusted with knowledge, ritual, technique, and memory, living in spaces set slightly apart from everyone else. They were not secret societies in the modern sense, yet they were the first communities to draw a boundary between those who were allowed in and those who remained outside. And from that moment, a primitive form of organization took shape, nameless, but unmistakably functional. In Mesopotamia, where the first city-states rose between two rivers, the growing complexity of urban life forced people to divide responsibilities. The scribes who pressed symbols into clay tablets were not just recording taxes or laws, they were the keepers of the city's collective memory. Because writing demanded strict discipline and training, scribes formed their own profession, a group with its own rhythm, working inside archives and small schoolrooms that ordinary citizens rarely entered. They were not noble like kings, but they did not blend into the mass of common workers either. They became the in-between class, the quiet machinery that kept the city running. And what mattered was not simply what they knew, but the fact that such knowledge could only survive inside semi-closed spaces, passed from teacher to student rather than from society to the public. In Egypt, that separation grew even deeper. The priests of Amun or Ptah operated like internal engines of their own world, with separate calendars, hierarchies, duties, and restricted living quarters that ordinary people could only observe from a distance. They set festival dates, oversaw temple storerooms, guarded knowledge of medicine, astronomy, rituals. But more importantly, they lived according to a rhythm different from the rest of society. Their world was closed not because of secrecy, but because their function required isolation. A soft wall emerged. No one forbade outsiders from approaching, yet the temple's structure itself made true access nearly impossible. What Mesopotamia and Egypt shared was not the hiding of knowledge, but something far more transformative. For the first time in human history, societies produced groups defined by their own specialized functions, their own physical spaces, and their own responsibilities. Anthropology would later call this functional stratification, the moment when a community stops operating as a single unified body and begins to form layers, each with its own rules and worldview. This slow but steady division became the earliest seed of every later fraternity, guild, or cloistered order. groups that existed for a specialized purpose, with an inner circle, a shared language, and a natural reason to keep some distance from the wider public. What they protected was not a secret. It was a procedure, a system, a craft that outsiders did not need, could not understand, or had no access to. And as these structures repeated themselves across centuries, a second current of history began to flow. A current not told through wars or dynasties, but through small groups who kept the world running from behind the curtain. They never called themselves secret societies, as that idea would not exist for thousands of years. Yet the moment humanity created separate workspaces, archives, temples, writing schools, it also created divisions in who could reach narrow forms of knowledge. And that division over time shaped the core logic of every hidden organization that would come later. Authority paired with responsibility, community paired with separation, and every task carried out with a natural, almost instinctive quietness. When we step away from the river kingdoms of Egypt and Mesopotamia, history carries us toward the Mediterranean, where Greece stretches across the water like a chain of islands waiting to be lit. The world remembers Greece as the cradle of reason, the land where public squares became stages for debate and free thought found its voice. But that is only the front-facing image of a much more intricate culture. Behind the figure of a philosopher standing in the agora was another Greece, quiet, enclosed, and shaped by small circles that nurtured ideas long before the public was ready to receive them. Before philosophy became a shared inheritance of humanity, it lived inside pockets of people, groups, not open to everyone. The Greeks believed knowledge was not something handed over like an object, but a kind of inner transformation. A student had to be prepared, the way a mountain climber steadies their breath before reaching the summit. That belief created the foundation for early intellectual circles, not to hide ideas from the world, but to shield the learner from the noise of the world. The Pythagoreans are one of the clearest examples. To them, numbers were not just tools for calculation, they were the secret language of the universe, a delicate architecture that stretched from the movement of the stars to the intervals on a lyre. To grasp such truths, students had to live with discipline, dietary rules, meditation, long periods of silence, and a focus so sharp it became ritual. Some disciples were not even allowed to hear Pythagoras directly. They listened from behind a veil, a reminder in Greek culture that certain knowledge should only be touched when one is strong enough to carry it. If the Pythagoreans represented the path of reason, the Eleusinian mysteries opened a doorway into the spiritual depth of Greece. In Eleusis, knowledge came not through logic but through experience, a symbolic journey of death and rebirth. Participants were forbidden to reveal what they witnessed, not because of dark superstition, but because the meaning of the ritual only lived inside the one who endured it. The ceremony required emotional maturity, and the Greeks believed some truths could be understood only through transformation, not instruction. The coexistence of these two paths, one rooted in reason, one in personal awakening, shaped a distinctly Greek model, knowledge with two levels. The public tier invited debate and open questioning. The deeper tier belonged to those willing to go farther, to test daring ideas quietly before releasing them into the world. These private circles were not hiding political schemes, they were more like spiritual laboratories where fragile concepts could grow in silence. And here lies the irony. These closed groups were the very places where many of the world's greatest ideas were born. Concepts of ethics, the soul, the nature of the universe, early scientific patterns. Most began in small rooms where only a few sat together. Only after they matured did they step into the Athenian square through the voice of Socrates or the writings of Plato. This dual structure, a public Greece and a hidden Greece, left an echo that stretched across Western history. It planted two seemingly opposite intuitions in the world: that knowledge should be shared but also preserved, that society must remain open, yet pioneering ideas sometimes need the shelter of small circles. And that tension became one of Greece's most subtle legacies for every later secret society. The understanding that some truths are not concealed, but simply need quiet tending before they are ready to stand in the light. When Greece was gradually absorbed into Rome, the quiet intellectual circles of Athens did not disappear. They simply changed shape. They adapted to a civilization that did not place philosophy at its peak, but instead centered its identity on stability, discipline, and obedience. If the Greek world built its communities around the question, what is truth? Then Rome built theirs around a far more practical concern: who can be trusted? From that question, the sodalitas, oath-bound alliances held together by loyalty and shared interests, became the hidden framework of Roman power. During the Republic, these sodalitas were not searching for enlightenment or spiritual awakening. They were pure political machinery. They provided backing for candidates, maintained unspoken agreements, rallied crowds, and ensured that promises made behind closed doors were honored when brought into the public arena. In Greece, ideas were born in small groups and then moved toward the square. In Rome, power moved in the opposite direction, from private rooms into the Senate floor. Every pledge, every bargain, every personal alliance was tied together by the loyalty of those within these circles. That was the quiet foundation of Roman politics, not philosophy, but networks of people. As the empire expanded from North Africa to Britain, the nature of these sodalitas shifted again. On distant frontiers, the survival of a legion depended not only on iron discipline, but on trust among soldiers. And so within the military, collegia, professional, and brotherhood-style associations emerged as inner communities with their own customs, rules, and rhythms of life. They were not secret societies in the modern sense, but they functioned as tight, cohesive circles. They became the invisible glue that allowed Roman legions to remain one of the most stable and enduring forces of the ancient world. When Rome transitioned from republic to empire, imperial suspicion toward any organized group grew stronger. Any association capable of influencing society beyond imperial control was restricted, monitored, or dissolved. In this atmosphere of vigilance, mystery religions such as Mithraism found room to grow. Followers of Mithras gathered in small underground sanctuaries where rituals reenacting the cosmic struggle between light and darkness unfolded in silence. Their secrecy was not born from occult fascination, it was born from necessity. In an empire where any organized group could be viewed as a threat to imperial authority, discretion became a condition for survival. It is no surprise that Mithraism became especially beloved among soldiers, men who lived with discipline, death, and the need to find meaning beyond their fragile fate. As the empire slid into crisis and once solid borders began to fracture, it was the sodalitas and collegia that provided refuge. The state grew weaker, but these small circles, occupational, military, spiritual, held firm. They offered people a sense of belonging, creating pockets of stability in an age of turmoil. To outsiders, they looked like minor associations. To members, they were family, trust, and a lifeline when the outside world became uncertain. And looking back across the three great civilizations, we see that the reasons for secret associations were never the same. Mesopotamia formed them because specialized knowledge needed controlled spaces. Greece formed them because ideas required quiet places to mature. Rome, however, formed them out of necessity, to maintain loyalty in an empire so vast that simple directives could not reach every corner. In that sense, Rome's hidden circles were not products of mystery or ambition, but the natural solution of a society too large to function without small, tightly bound groups. It was these circles, not the imperial bureaucracy, that quietly held the empire together far longer than anyone might imagine. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, it was not only the stone roads that were left to weeds or the amphitheaters that fell silent. What truly broke was the engine that kept life moving. The systems of law, trade, transportation, military order, and especially the network of knowledge that had kept Europe connected for centuries. Libraries burned, schools closed their doors, walls that once held the memory of an empire crumbled into shells. Few people could even read anymore. The darkness of the age did not come from stormy skies, but from the way knowledge suddenly became scattered fragments drifting without guardians. In that chaos, the church became the final anchor, not because of ambition, but because it was one of the few institutions that still had discipline, organization, and a shared language stretching across continents. People did not come to the church to be educated. They came seeking meaning, and that instinct made the church the only structure still capable of touching what was left of the old world, not because it tried to monopolize knowledge, but because no one else remained to hold it. Inside small monasteries scattered across Europe, monks copied manuscripts by hand, a task so slow that a single page might cost a piece of a lifetime. Yet amid ruins, choices had to be made. Not every book could be saved. Texts too complex, deemed heretical or unrelated to religious purpose, were set aside. Knowledge vanished not out of malice, but because it was too vast, the scribes too few, and the age too fragile to carry the full diversity of thought. History forced knowledge through a narrow doorway. The subtle truth is that this control did not arise from conspiracy but from fear. With borders collapsing, famine and disease lurking, and enemies appearing without warning, ideas that pushed beyond familiar boundaries looked dangerous. Society longed for stability, and that longing naturally turned the church into a filter. In those centuries, people needed safety more than understanding. Yet while knowledge narrowed under the weight of orthodoxy, another movement, faint but persistent, began in the shadows. Manuscripts that were never fully recopied passed quietly from curious monks to wandering scholars, multilingual merchants, and sometimes to nobles hungry for learning. They formed no official group and followed no rules, yet together they created a scattered network in which each person held a tiny sliver of the old world. A map might be hidden in a merchant's chest, a Greek text copied in secret on the back of a prayer, a fragment of an ancient author preserved only because a monk decorated the margin and accidentally kept the crucial line, a manuscript crossing into the Middle East annotated by Arab scholars, then returned to the West centuries later. Knowledge was not locked away. It was fractured, drifting like shards carried by the curiosity of strangers. In an age when light had to disguise itself under a cloak of silence, knowledge became a coded signal. It made sense only to someone able to piece it together. The scribe did not dare acknowledge the treasure he held. The traveler who carried a fragment often had no idea of its value. The seeker relied more on intuition than on any map. And it was this fragile, whispering chain, these quiet breaths of knowledge, that kept the memory of the ancient world from burning out completely. And so in what history calls the Dark Ages, knowledge did not die, it changed form. It curled inward, hid in shadows, scattered into small pockets of private curiosity, and waited patiently for an age stable enough to welcome it back. The irony is profound. In a time when silence was required for survival, that very silence became the cradle that preserved the faint sparks of learning, sparks that would one day ignite the intellectual rebirth of Europe. As Europe slowly awakened after centuries of turmoil, trade routes reopened, roads expanded, and new towns rose along the great rivers. The continent began to form a new kind of strength, the strength of organized groups. Not the power of kings, nor the authority of old noble families, but the power of people bound together by discipline, purpose, and shared ideals. Out of this shifting landscape emerged a remarkable order, one that the world would remember with a mix of fascination and myth. The Templars. In 1119, Hugues de Payens and Godfrey de Saint-Omer led 7 young knights to meet King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. Their intention was simple: to form a small group dedicated to protecting the road between Jaffa and Jerusalem for pilgrims. They owned no land, commanded no army, and possessed no wealth. What they carried instead was a vow of poverty, a clarity of purpose, and the solemn discipline of men who placed faith far above ambition. But what set them apart from every knight of their time was not their sword. It was the vow they swore before the church. They saw themselves as both warriors and monks, a dual identity without precedent in European history. When they were housed in the area believed to be the site of Solomon's temple, they gained far more than shelter. They were placed at the heart of a symbol revered across 3 great cultures. The connection between the knights and this sacred ground gave rise to a name, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, that carried a weight far greater than their small numbers. In an age when symbols could move entire continents, they suddenly found themselves surrounded by a sacred aura, drawing both reverence and curiosity. Their way of life soon forced the medieval world to rethink what a knight could be. They did not marry, did not accumulate private wealth, and stayed clear of the constant feuds among noble lineages. All possessions, income, and spoils of war belonged to the order itself. This renunciation was not merely discipline, it was a reconstruction of honor. It pulled them out of the usual web of family interests and political favors. Because of it, they became a force that kings could not easily buy, nobles could not manipulate, and common people trusted as a shield of divine protection. By 1129, at the Council of Troy, the Church officially recognized the Templars. That moment placed them in a position unmatched in history, a sacred military force that belonged to no kingdom, answered to no king or lord, and carried weapons in the name of faith rather than territory. With a strict hierarchy, monastic lifestyle, and the sanctioned right to bear arms, the Templars became the first Western institution where religion and military duty fused, not to convert, but to protect. From that foundation, they entered a phase of growth that even they could not have predicted. They received land for commanderies, exemptions from taxes, and full papal backing. But what truly made them powerful was not privilege, it was the trust they inspired. In an era when pilgrims had to cross war zones, face bandits, and endure the harshness of nature, a force loyal only to the Church, not to any local lord, became the safest refuge travelers could imagine. That trust opened a new role for them, guardians of wealth for those journeying to the Holy Land. They recorded deposits, safeguarded valuables, and allowed travelers to reclaim their funds at any Templar house across their network. No one called it a bank, yet the system they built functioned as Europe's first cross-border financial network. And perhaps most striking of all, they did not create it for profit. It emerged naturally from the need to protect travelers in an age that had no concept of financial stability. From a humble band of knights, the Templars evolved into a hybrid order, part military, part financial, a structure the world had never seen. As disciplined as monks, as efficient as elite soldiers, and operating like the seeds of a modern financial system, they ushered in an era where organizations, not individuals, not dynasties, could hold power beyond borders, beyond territory, and far beyond the imagination of their time. By the 13th century, the Templars were no longer just guardians of pilgrims. That original mission had faded into the background, replaced by something far larger and far more discreet. They had become the institution where kingdoms placed their most precious asset: stability. When King Henry III of England moved the royal treasury into the Templar vault in London, he did not do it for superstition or ritual. He did it because he understood something simple and absolute. No enemy could undermine their reputation. In a Europe shaken constantly by war and famine, that trust became a wall stronger than any fortress. But safeguarding wealth was only the beginning. When kings needed to raise armies, when nobles wanted to build fortresses, when merchants planned new trade routes, they turned to the Templars. The order lent money without threats or plunder. Their influence lay not in steel, but in the flow of commerce. To lose the ability to transact was to lose one's standing, and in an age where honor was measured by one's capacity to repay debt, the Templars held a soft but decisive form of leverage that surpassed any weapon. What made their system extraordinary was not the amount of gold they managed, but the way they managed it. The Templars kept books through a triple-layered system, each layer checking the others to eliminate errors. Their command centers communicated using symbols and codes understood only by insiders. They could transmit instructions from Paris to Acre with a speed and precision that made royal courts envious. In a world without postal services or centralized administrations, the Templars became a rapid, continent-spanning network. Their fortresses were like stone-wrapped financial hubs, thick walls, disciplined guards, and vaults sunk deep below ground. Yet the real safeguard was not stone or metal, it was reputation. Only an institution trusted across half of Europe could hold immense wealth without relying on excessive locks or chains. Trust became their strongest armor. Finance, however, was only half the story. The other half was information. Because correspondence, military plans, and financial records traveled through the same channels, the Templars inadvertently held a panoramic view of Europe, a view no kingdom could hope to match. They knew which road was about to be hit by bandits, which cities were nearing famine, which kings were drowning in debt, which regions were rippling with unrest. In a world without newspapers or oversight, any organization with that breadth of insight wielded a new kind of power, the power of knowledge itself. The fusion of military discipline, financial engineering, information networks, and monastic life made the Templars unlike anything that had ever existed. They were not a simple army, not a monastery, not a bank, and not a government office. They were all of those things at once, a hybrid structure so complex that history has no true parallel to place beside it. And because of that uniqueness, they stepped onto dangerous ground. Not because they sought to build an empire, but because they stood at the intersection of the four greatest forces of the Middle Ages: money, faith, trade, and war. A group wealthier than kings, more disciplined than royal armies, and more independent than the church. That was a contradiction that unsettled every ruler who saw it. No one said it aloud, but the tension was there, smouldering like a coal waiting for a gust of wind. And as with every story shaped by the collision of power and fear, it would take only one person, clever enough or ruthless enough, to bring the entire order crashing down in a single night. As Europe entered the year 1307, the Templars were not weakened, defeated, or discredited. They were not fading with the era. They were pulled down by a political strike planned in silence, executed with a cold precision that left them no room to breathe. The man behind the blow was Philip IV of France, a king with a regal face but a heart ruled by unease and an ambition that could not tolerate rivals. What troubled him was not the Templars' wealth, but their independence, an order that did not need the king, did not obey the king, and, more dangerously, was respected by the people far more than the king himself. In a France sinking into financial crisis, and where royal authority was constantly tested, Philip understood one thing clearly. As long as the Templars stood strong, he could never be the supreme force in his own kingdom. He could not defeat them with soldiers. They were too skilled. He could not defeat them with the law. They belonged to the church, not the crown. So he reached for the weapon that has shaken every era, religious accusation. One whisper at the right moment could turn admired men into enemies of the faith. Philip began quietly. The Templars had secret rituals. They worshipped a strange head. They forced initiates to insult the cross. They held a kind of power even the Pope could not control. None of it needed to be true. It only needed to make people uncertain. And in the Middle Ages, doubt was stronger than proof. Before dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, the order went out across France. Arrest every Templar. No warning, no negotiation, only doors smashed open, warrior monks bound in the dark before they could fully wake, and a vast net tightening in a matter of hours. Men who had once stood at the center of power suddenly became criminals, without understanding what crime they had supposedly committed. From that moment, the legend of Friday the 13th was born. Interrogations and torture followed. Absurd accusations gradually turned into confessions as human endurance was pushed past its limits. The Templars did not fall because of guilt. They fell because no body can withstand endless pain. Some died silently. Others signed prepared confessions simply to make the torment stop. All were swept into a storm Philip had crafted with meticulous care. To complete his plan, he needed the Church to stand behind him. Pope Clement V, constrained inside the Avignon papacy, surrounded by French influence, was too weak to resist. He did not seek to destroy the Templars, but his hesitation opened the door for Philip. In power games, silence is often sharper than any sword. Investigations spread across Europe. Some kingdoms complied reluctantly, others disapproved quietly, but lacked the courage to oppose France openly. And then a subtle shift occurred. The question, "Are the Templars guilty?" faded, replaced by a more practical concern. Who will inherit their enormous wealth? At that moment, truth no longer mattered. Only ambition and power spoke. The tragedy reached its peak in 1314. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, was led to the stake after 7 years of imprisonment. Just before the flames rose, he declared that the Templars were innocent and that their destruction was nothing more than the product of political greed. Legend says he turned toward the King of France and the Pope, declaring that both would have to answer to God within a year. And soon after, both men died, a coincidence that gave his final words a mythic glow history has never been able to fully dispel. Many believe the Templars vanished after the purge of 1307, but history does not disappear because someone commands it to. It does not collapse into ash. It slips into the cracks, reshapes itself, and survives in forms that are harder to see. Great organizations do not always die. Sometimes they simply shed their skin. The Templars did the same. They did not leave Europe. They left the center of the stage, sinking quietly into other structures like seeds carrying the memory of a burnt tree. Their silence in the years that followed is what astonishes later generations the most. An order once known for military strength, financial sophistication, and iron discipline left no public protest. But silence was not surrender. It was the instinct of men who had lived too long in a world of ritual and secrecy. They knew that sometimes the only way to endure is to disappear. And soon scattered traces began to show across Europe. Templar symbols carved into old stone walls, rituals with familiar patterns appearing inside new guilds, stories of knights fleeing north. There were no complete proofs, but neither were there absolute denials. Only fragments. And fragments often preserve a truth the whole wall cannot. Portugal, the clearest place where the seed sprouted again. Unlike Philip IV's France, Portugal never saw the Templars as enemies. King Denis believed the charges of heresy were baseless, and he knew his kingdom could not afford to lose the warriors who had defended its borders again and again. When the Church ordered the dissolution of the Templars, he made a decision unlike any other in Europe. He opened an escape route. He founded the Order of Christ, a new order in name, but with the same men, the same lands, and the same expertise. The functions were renamed, but the spirit remained intact. With one clever move, the Templars were legalized under a new identity and allowed to survive. The consequences extended far beyond Europe. The Order of Christ became the intellectual and technical backbone of Portugal's maritime age. Henry the Navigator, or the architect of the great explorations, served as its leader. On the ships that cut across the Atlantic, the Red Cross on the sails carried Templar heritage alongside Vasco da Gama and Cabral into the map of the world. They no longer looked toward Jerusalem, they looked toward the horizon, Scotland, where the seed blended into stone and legend. When France hunted the Templars, many knights were believed to have fled to Scotland, a land not fully obedient to the Pope. Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated, so he was under no obligation to surrender them. If the knights needed refuge, Scotland made the most sense. From this legends grew that they aided Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. No one knows how much is truth and how much is memory embroidered across time. But the legend persists because people want to believe that betrayed warriors found a land that honored them. There they met the stonemason guilds, groups that built churches, fortresses, bridges. These were professional associations with rules, symbols, rites, and most importantly, a closed structure into which the Templars could easily blend. Surviving knights, carrying their discipline and organizational experience, seeped into these guilds like water into stone. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Scottish lodges began adopting rituals that stretched beyond pure craftsmanship. Twin pillars, compasses, coded phrases, all hinting at influences from another layer of knowledge. The Templars did not rebuild their order. They let their influence flow quietly into new forms. Other currents: Italy, Germany, England. Some Templars moved into Italy, merging with merchant guilds. Some went to Germany, following mercenary groups they had once commanded. Others remained in England, where monasteries still preserved their documents and accounts. Nowhere bore the name Templar, yet wherever there was discipline, ritual, and discretion, their shadow appeared. The true legacy, not a secret order, but a way of thinking. The Templars did not leave behind a successor organization. They left behind a method, a military mindset, a guild-like structure, an ability to vanish when the age shifted, a technique of preserving knowledge through symbol and ceremony. They survived not through the sword, but through adaptability. No longer wearing white cloaks, yet still carrying the Templar memory. No longer owning territory, yet living within hidden networks. No longer fielding armies, yet retaining the discipline of warriors. The Templars did not disappear. They simply chose a different shape. They became a layer of sediment beneath the surface of European history. a layer visible only to those patient and attentive enough to see its faint lines stretching across the centuries. As Europe stepped from the late Middle Ages into the Renaissance, knowledge did not return with fanfare or towering libraries. It came back through quieter paths, through the hands of carvers, stonemasons, cathedral builders, and fortress engineers. The craft guilds, originally created to protect workers' rights, suddenly became natural shelters for the scattered streams of knowledge that had drifted across centuries. Their secrecy, discipline, and long-standing traditions form the perfect environment for new ideas to survive without attracting suspicion or punishment. Among countless guilds, the stonemasons stood at the center. They did not merely build churches and palaces, they shaped structures that Europe regarded as symbols of cosmic order. A dome that stood firm spoke of mastery over force. A bell tower stretching toward the sky reflected an understanding of proportion. A cathedral that endured for centuries was the embodiment of a wisdom no textbook could explain. Architecture at that time was not yet a science. It was philosophy carved in stone. And that knowledge was transmitted not through books, but through symbols, gestures, and rituals, things no outsider could understand simply by looking. From this foundation, a quiet transformation began. As new ideas struggled to appear openly, with the Church still holding absolute authority over thought, seekers of knowledge found themselves drawn to the stonemasons' lodges as a kind of middle ground. Scholars, nobles, monks, merchants. They came not to learn the craft, but to find a safe place for ideas that stretched beyond allowed boundaries. Soon, the line between teaching a trade and teaching a worldview began to blur. The stonemasons, whether intentionally or by natural drift, became a space where building techniques merged with philosophy, geometry merged with ethics, and labor merged with thought. What made this blend extraordinary is that it did not happen by decree or written rule. No one announced it. It simply happened. Chisels, compasses, squares, plumb lines, practical tools began to carry deeper symbolic meaning, becoming metaphors for inner balance. The three traditional levels of the craft, apprentice, journeyman, master, evolved into symbolic stages of personal growth. And the lodge, once only a place to discuss arches and columns, became a place to discuss the order and meaning of the universe. At the same time, Europe was convulsing. The Black Death shattered the old world, leaving society broken in body and spirit. When old beliefs lost their power, new ideas slipped in. Universities were emerging, yet still too weak to stand openly against religious authority, driving many thinkers to seek alternative places for exchange. And the lodges, with their secrecy, integrity, and disciplined structure, became an obvious refuge. Rough stone halls lit by flickering candlelight began to echo with the voices of Aristotle, Euclid, Arabic cartographers, Greek philosophy, and manuscripts that society was not yet ready to accept. The strange thing is that no one of that era believed they were creating a new secret order. They were simply answering the survival needs of knowledge itself, finding a safe place to speak, a structure strong enough to protect, and rituals capable of passing on what could not be written openly. The guilds already had these elements, so knowledge flowed into them the way water finds the cracks in stone. By the late 16th century, the stonemason guilds had changed so much that they were no longer purely craft organizations. The number of actual builders diminished. In their place came scholars, nobles, thinkers, and those seeking a deeper spiritual framework. They did not yet bear the name Freemasons, but all the signs of an emerging order were already there: multi-layered symbols, initiation rites, ranks arranged like steps of inner development, and above all, a belief that a human being could be built the way a cathedral is. Stone by stone, layer upon layer, into the most complete version of oneself. Freemasonry was never a secret society in the sense of hiding itself from the world. It was more of a closed space than a secret one, not flashy, but not conspiratorial, not publicly broadcast, but not lurking in darkness either. It was simply a door kept shut in an age full of prejudice, a space where new thoughts could grow without being crushed before they were even born. In those small lodge rooms, people were allowed to test ideas, ask bold questions, debate with reason, and nurture the desire for change without being labeled disrespectful or dangerous. Not long after philosophically inclined lodges began forming in Scotland and England, a pivotal moment arrived. In 1717, 4 London lodges united to create the Grand Lodge of England, the first officially recorded Masonic organization. At the time, no one realized that moment would become historic, but later generations look back at it as the beginning of one of Europe's most influential intellectual movements. From there, Freemasonry spread with a speed that surprised even its earliest members. Across Europe, thinkers like Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Mozart, each following their own path, found themselves within Masonry's sphere. They carried no weapons, built no armies, and conquered no territory. They shaped the world with music, ideas, and reason. And those softer forces later became the moral foundation for new societies taking shape. In America, a young nation forming out of what seemed like open frontier, Masonic ideas seeped into daily life as naturally as air. Washington, Franklin, Paul Revere. Their names appear in nearly every discussion about Masonry's influence on the American Revolution. But the truth doesn't lie in membership lists or rings. It lies in the spirit they shared, valuing liberty, elevating reason, respecting personal responsibility, and believing that society is a structure humans can rebuild themselves. Freemasonry didn't create the revolution, but it left behind a language of thought that the founding generation absorbed almost instinctively. In France, the picture was much more complex. Masonic lodges were larger, more diverse, and more socially inclusive than those in England. Here, Enlightenment nobles, writers, lawyers, intellectuals, and merchants could sit at the same table. An extraordinary thing in a rigidly stratified society. There is no evidence that Freemasonry organized the revolution, but by creating a space where people from different classes could speak as equals, it planted a dangerous idea into the minds of many. Society could be changed. When the revolution erupted, some Masonic symbols appeared in art and culture. But that was not proof of orchestration, only a reflection that many leaders of change came from a generation steeped in reason, personal ethics, and symbolic equality, all values Masonry preserved. Yet it was precisely this widespread, almost invisible presence that led many to assume that wherever change occurred, Freemasons must be behind it. From here, the first seeds of the myth, a secret society controls the world, began to take root. It is essential to understand that Freemasonry was not a political organization. They wrote no slogans, commanded no movements, and marched in no crowds. What they created was the capacity for political thought, encouraging freedom of inquiry, freedom to question, and placing human dignity at the center of progress. A person who entered a lodge did not become a revolutionary overnight, but they became someone who could analyze, reason, and look at social structures through the lens of logic instead of tradition. In the old world, that alone was enough to create tremors. In the storms of the 18th century revolutions, Freemasonry was like a house where people could think about how society ought to be built. Symbols like the square and compasses did not stand for conspiracy. They stood for the hope of creating a world with order, balance, and moral grounding, both in architecture and in the human heart. But it was precisely because their intellectual influence grew so wide that Freemasonry became a target of collective imagination. Not because they did anything wrong, but because the world had never seen a community capable of gathering people from different classes into one room as equals. No kings, no priests, only personal merit. In the old social order, that was unsettling, and unsettling things are often mistaken for mysterious. And just as these suspicions were spreading like a thin mist across Europe, a new story emerged in Bavaria. A brief story, lasting less than a decade, yet its name would outlive its reality, outgrow its borders, and slip far beyond the truth behind it. It was the story of the Illuminati. The Illuminati was founded on a spring night in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt, a young professor at the University of Ingolstadt. He was not an occultist or an alchemist, but a pure product of the Enlightenment, a generation beginning to believe that humanity could unlock its own future through knowledge and ethics. In Bavaria, a place heavy with dogma, where the church interfered with thought and nobles clung to privilege unrelated to merit, Weishaupt saw a society moving slower than the age demanded. He did not believe in violence as a path to reform. He believed change must begin within the individual through independent thinking, personal virtue, and inner maturity. But to keep these ideas from becoming grounds for persecution, he created a small group, discreet but not mystical, meant to offer a quiet room where new thought could find air to grow. The early days of the Illuminati were almost shockingly simple. A few students, a handful of young intellectuals, sitting in still rooms discussing politics, philosophy, ethics, and how people might become better. No strange rituals, no ominous symbols, no secret plan, only reason and ambition. What made the Illuminati unique was their desire to improve humanity at its roots. They did not seek to overthrow governments. They believed that if thinking changed, society would follow. But in the late 18th century, as new ideas spread too quickly and collided with old structures, the group began attracting unwanted attention. When some Illuminati members joined Masonic lodges, rumors exploded. They were infiltrating the stonemasons, plotting political schemes, undermining religion. Truth disappeared beneath layers of fear and imagination. As the organization grew, the church felt threatened, nobles grew uneasy, and the state became alert. In an age where rumor carried more weight than fact, the Illuminati soon became a public target. In 1785, the Bavarian government issued an edict banning the group. Documents were seized, members arrested, and Weishaupt was forced into exile. The society survived less than a decade, too short to produce concrete achievements, but long enough for its name to be etched into history. The irony is that the Illuminati died in reality, only to live more fiercely in Europe's imagination. Their disappearance left a vacuum, and people always fill a vacuum with the simplest explanation they can grasp. After the French Revolution, as the old order collapsed, borders shifted, and both monarchy and church wavered, Europe fell into deep uncertainty. People needed a cause, a name, a hand behind the curtain to blame for what they could not yet understand. The Illuminati became the mirror for every fear of the age. To royalists, they were the architects of decline. To religious conservatives, they threatened doctrine. To the anxious, they were the invisible wind that toppled the old world. Legend began to replace history. The Illuminati became a clandestine network infiltrating governments, an unseen force with a plan to rule the world, even a fusion of philosophy, politics, and magic. All false, yet all easy to believe. The 19th century brought constant upheaval. The revolutions of 1848 swept across the continent. Italy, Germany, and Hungary fought for unification or independence. Liberal movements rose, were crushed, then rose again, stronger. When chaos erupted everywhere at once, people began to see patterns and concluded that some hidden power must be pulling the strings. The Illuminati, long gone, suddenly found themselves named once again. What inflated the legend was not politics but psychology. When we know too little about something, we exaggerate it. The secrecy of the original group, once just a protective measure, was misread as intricate organization. Their silence after dissolution, and simply because they no longer existed, was interpreted as stealth. And their sudden disappearance, caused by political suppression, was taken as proof that they were preparing for something grand. By the mid-19th century, the Illuminati no longer belonged to history at all. They had stepped fully into myth. Their name appeared in novels, political pamphlets, coffeehouse debates, and fiery speeches. Romantic writers cast them as symbols of forbidden knowledge. Conservative groups painted them as enemies of order. Liberal thinkers claimed them as proof that ideas could live outside tradition. Everyone projected onto that name a piece of their own fear or desire. The result is that the Illuminati stopped being a society and became a symbol of transition, of collective unease, of the feeling that history is shaped by invisible currents human eyes cannot quite see. And from that myth-making, Europe entered a new era, an age of mysticism, spiritual societies, and quests for meaning beyond the boundaries of traditional reason. When the Illuminati disappeared from the real world, the most surprising thing wasn't their downfall, but the way their name continued to live so powerfully in the human imagination. People expected them to fade into history like countless small Enlightenment-era societies. Instead, the moment they vanished opened the door to something new. Myth began to replace truth. Their disappearance didn't create silence, it created a void. And in an age full of chaos, a void is the last thing people want to leave empty. They needed an explanation, a cause, a someone to blame for the changes they could not understand. The Illuminati became the perfect mirror for that uncertainty. After the French Revolution, Europe entered a period of violent transformation. Empires rose and fell, old orders broke apart, and borders were redrawn within only a few decades. Values that had stood firm for centuries, royal power, the authority of the church, the social hierarchy, were suddenly in question. People no longer knew what to believe. In times like that, simple explanations become far more tempting than the complicated truth of history. At the same time, royalist factions and conservative religious groups found in the Illuminati an ideal scapegoat. They needed reasons for the weakening of the nobility, the fading influence of the church, and the rise of liberal ideas. And instead of looking deeply into the intellectual currents of the era, they blamed everything on a secret society. Not because the Illuminati were actually powerful enough, but because the name was easy to point to. The fewer the facts, the faster the myth could grow. Soon, collective imagination began reshaping the Illuminati into something entirely different. What had once been a small group focused on education and moral reform turned into a hidden network infiltrating governments, an invisible organization plotting world domination, a mysterious force blending philosophy, politics, and magic. None of this was true, but all of it spread easily. The fears of the era created fertile ground for every legend to take root. The 19th century plunged European politics into constant unrest. The revolutions of 1848 spread like sparks through dry grass. Italy, Germany, and Hungary burned with the desire for independence or unification. Uprisings flared, collapsed, and flared again. Living in this non-stop motion, people began searching for patterns, revolts erupting at the same time, ideas traveling rapidly across borders, waves of freedom rising as though guided by an unseen hand. And once that mindset took hold, the Illuminati dead for nearly a century, were summoned back into the conversation. What strengthened the myth even more was not politics or the press, but human psychology encountering secrecy. In social psychology, there is a strange rule. The less we know about something, the bigger, more dangerous, and more organized we imagine it to be. The secrecy of the Bavarian Illuminati, originally just a way to protect themselves, was misread as a sophisticated underground structure. Their silence, simply the result of being disbanded, was treated as proof of hidden activity. Their sudden disappearance convinced many that they must still be out there, waiting for the right moment. Sometimes truth simply cannot compete with collective imagination. By the middle of the 19th century, the Illuminati were no longer seen as a real organization. They had become a symbol of transformation, of uncertainty, of the feeling that history is being shaped by invisible forces. Their name appeared in poetry, novels, political pamphlets, occult writings, and café debates. Romantic writers imagined them as guardians of forbidden knowledge. Extremists viewed them as enemies of order. Activists treated them as champions of free thought. Everyone projected onto the name a piece of their own fear or desire. And out of that myth-making, Europe stepped into a new era at the end of the 19th century. An era of mysticism, spiritual secret societies, and a growing search for meaning beyond reason. This was an age when scientific knowledge opened horizons no one had imagined before. Yet at the same time, it shattered many of the beliefs that had comforted humanity for centuries. As the material world grew clearer, the spiritual world grew dimmer. What was once sacred began to lose its place. And as gigantic industrial cities rose from the ground, people found themselves feeling small inside the very world they had built. Into that emptiness, people began searching for new communities, not to control politics or manipulate power, but to find comfort, connection, and a sense of meaning that stood beyond machinery and steel. It was the perfect soil for esoteric societies to emerge. And in the 1880s, one organization, and mysterious yet radiant, like a symbolic painting brought to life, began casting its strange new light across Britain. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Golden Dawn was neither a craft guild like the Masons, nor a reformist movement like the Bavarian Illuminati. It was a delicate fusion of ancient philosophy, Kabbalah, tarot, alchemy, Western mysticism, and Egyptian symbolism. Its rituals were crafted with artistic precision, not to impress, but to awaken the sense that human beings carried a deeper spiritual layer inside them, one that science of the time had no vocabulary for. Before long, Golden Dawn attracted some of Europe's most creative minds: poets, writers, musicians, painters. W.B. Yeats, one of the great poets of the 20th century, saw the Golden Dawn as a place where he could touch the deepest part of his inner self. For these artists, the order was not a gateway to power, but a sanctuary for the inner world, a realm of the subconscious that psychology would only begin to explore decades later. But Golden Dawn was just the opening sign. A few years earlier, in 1875, a broader and more ambitious movement had already taken shape: Theosophy. Helena Blavatsky, one of the most controversial and magnetic figures of her century, founded the Theosophical Society by gathering ideas from Eastern religions, Greek philosophy, alchemical tradition, and Western mysticism. She blended them into a system that emphasized the unity of all religions and the spiritual evolution of humankind. What gave Theosophy its reach was not its perfection, but its timing. It spoke directly to the new hunger of the age, the need to reconcile rapidly advancing science with a spiritual longing that had never fully disappeared. It told people that they were more than physical bodies, that human history moved in spiritual cycles, and that the universe operated on layers of law invisible to ordinary sight. Theosophy was not secret in the traditional sense. It had libraries, schools, conferences, publications, and it even influenced modern art, most famously through Kandinsky, who believed his abstract painting grew directly from theosophical ideas. But it carried the spirit of a mystery school, the belief that deep knowledge could only be reached by those whose inner lives were prepared to receive it. Yet as Europe entered the 20th century, with the age of steam, global empires, heavy industry, and conflicts beyond comprehension, these gentle, esoteric communities began to fade. A new kind of closed circle emerged, one no longer defined by symbols or metaphysics, but by something far more concrete: finance, industry, military power, and international politics. It was the moment when elite networks began shaping the new century. And from smoke-filled boardrooms, from round tables without minutes, from meetings remembered only by the few who attended, a completely different chapter of secret history began. One where light and shadow were no longer divided by ritual, but by interests, power, and decisions capable of tilting the axis of the world. The industrial age brought with it a new kind of circle among the elite, one very different from the mystical groups like the Golden Dawn or the Theosophists. These circles were not searching for the spirit world. They were not tracing the path of the soul, wandering through metaphysical layers or chasing ancient symbols. What they wanted was far more tangible: power in the material world. Yet strangely, the way they organized themselves carried an uncanny resemblance to the secret societies of the past: initiation rituals, internal rules, private symbols, and above all, exclusivity. That exclusivity made them harder to access than any public institution, even though their goals were almost purely practical. What stands out is that most of these circles did not grow out of direct political ambition. They began in places that seemed harmless: universities, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale. Their moss-covered stone walls, quiet lawns, and church-like libraries became the cradle of a new leadership class. Within those spaces, students from wealthy, noble, or intellectual families gathered into societies, closed groups with their own traditions, meeting rooms, and sometimes initiation rituals that outsiders could never fully understand. These student societies were not discussing magic or the occult. They existed so people could recognize each other's value, forming bonds that might last a lifetime. In an industrial world powered by factories, banks, and expanding railroad companies, relationships became a currency even stronger than aristocratic lineage. A young student joining a society in his 20s could find business partners, political allies, or lifelong patrons decades later. The world was running on steam and telegraphs. In that environment, networks became the most important weapon of all. But influence did not come only from universities. In London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, the gentlemen's clubs of the aristocracy became the places where powerful men met without minutes, records, or formal agendas. Colonial ventures were discussed there, transcontinental railway plans were shaped, and banking policies were decided in smoke-filled rooms. There were no mystical rites and no hidden chambers, but these were every bit as closed and powerful as any secret order. These circles were not mysterious in a spiritual sense, they were discreet in a social one. And that discretion created a new kind of structure, what modern researchers call the network elites, a class connected by education, family ties, financial interests, and geography. In a world where strength grew with scale, these circles began linking together quietly but effectively. A Cambridge-trained engineer walked into a London club. A Yale businessman joined a commercial network in New York. A German diplomat reconnected with his old student society in Heidelberg. These seemingly scattered relationships, when layered upon one another, began to form an invisible network stretching across Europe and North America. No one controlled it, but everyone within it benefited. Inside this network, ideas traveled faster than newspapers, and important decisions could be made over a single dinner instead of through slow bureaucratic channels. And for the first time in history, the elite no longer relied solely on bloodlines or noble titles. They relied on knowledge, education, and the ability to connect. It was a quiet but profound shift in the structure of power. Within these circles, information, business plans, and social directions were exchanged, not because they wanted to hide things, but because the mechanics of the age forced major power to run through informal channels. To outsiders, it looked like a vague, tightly woven, almost incomprehensible web. And when a network becomes too strong, too wide, and touches too many parts of society, the familiar question inevitably returns: who is controlling it? That question hung in the air like a nameless shadow. But the reality was far less mystical than people imagined. The elite circles between 1850 and 1910 had no supreme leader, no plan for world domination, no secret doctrine. What they did have was influence over policy, trade, finance, and even the way nations shaped their worldviews. And as the 20th century approached, these circles grew closer than ever. What had once been loose connections began to solidify into cross-national networks where the decisions of a small group could ripple across an entire continent. It was the moment history stood ready to shift into a new phase, one where the idea of a secret society would no longer be tied to mystical ritual, but to the realities of global power in the modern age. While Europe was shaping its closed circles of elite influence during the industrial era, a different story, similar in structure but unique in character, was quietly unfolding across the Atlantic. The United States was still young then, not even a century removed from its founding, yet already nurturing an ambition to become the leading nation of the New World. To do that, it needed something Europe had possessed for centuries: tightly knit networks of elites where people connected through education, family, ambition, and a shared long-term vision of the future. If Europe's elite circles grew out of aristocratic culture and ancient universities, America's formed in a landscape that was far younger and far more practical. There were no noble titles, no thousand-year-old halls, no deep-rooted traditions, only universities eager to become the Oxford of the New World, and newly risen families hoping to build influence across generations. From that need, a wave of collegiate secret societies emerged, and none carried more mystique than the one name that still echoes today: Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones was founded at Yale University in 1832 by William Huntington Russell and Alphonso Taft, the father of future President William Howard Taft. It was not like Freemasonry with its philosophical tradition, nor like the Bavarian Illuminati with its reformist spirit. Skull and Bones grew out of a distinctly American impulse to build a future leadership network based on strict selection and unwavering internal loyalty. In a young society whose institutions lacked the depth of long tradition, Skull and Bones deliberately created what the nation was missing: ritual, symbols, a feeling of age and permanence. The skull and crossbones emblem, the number 322, the windowless clubhouse known as the Tomb, these created an eerie, mysterious atmosphere. But that was only the cultural shell. What truly sustained the society was its people. The core of Skull and Bones has always been human capital. Each year, the society selects only 15 students, those judged to have the potential to become future leaders, student presidents, heirs of powerful families, exceptional talents, people expected to enter politics or Wall Street. Being tapped for Bones was not just an honor, it was a quiet signal to the world: this person will shape America. Over time, that signal proved astonishingly accurate. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, countless bonesmen held key positions: presidents, senators, security advisors, Supreme Court justices, bankers, and CEOs of major financial firms, policymakers in foreign affairs, figures standing behind the most influential American institutions. Not because the society controlled them, but because they were already the sort of people likely to rise, and now they had a network to support them. In America's fiercely competitive environment, internal trust became a form of capital just as important as financial wealth. A bonesman entering Congress would immediately recognize the peers who had sat with him every week in a secret Yale chamber. A bonesman walking into Wall Street would see familiar faces from late-night discussions during their youth. These bonds created a kind of new aristocracy, one not based on bloodlines, but on education and the ability to connect. Skull and Bones was not the only society. Princeton had the Ivy Club, Harvard had the Porcellian, Stanford and Berkeley had their own private circles. But Yale, especially Bones, became iconic because of its dense interconnectedness and the prominence of its members. It is important to emphasize this. The mystery of Bones does not come from conspiracies, but from the effectiveness of a closed network. They do not write policy, but they produce the people who will write policy. They do not control Wall Street, but they cultivate the people who will run it. They do not command the military, but they shape the individuals who will sit in the Pentagon's meeting rooms. All of this happens in silence. No banners, no slogans, no vows of domination. Only personal relationships that last a lifetime. That silence leads outsiders to imagine secret power, but in reality, what the society holds is simply the continuity of a network. Yet as more and more of its members stepped into government and finance, America entered the 20th century with an unavoidable question. Were these elite societies merely networks, or had they become systems of influence? That question opened the door to a new chapter, one in which organizations did not merely select individuals, but began shaping national vision and even global vision. It was the era of the Rhodes Trust, the Round Table, and the early 20th century policy groups, where closed circles stepped out of the shadows of academia and into the heart of international power. This was the age of industrial nations, of empires stretching across time zones, of central banks, mass media, and layered diplomacy. In that vast landscape, a subtle truth slowly came into focus. Power no longer belonged to a single ruler, a glittering royal household, or any one isolated empire. Power lived in the network. Not a secret network woven from conspiracy, but a network formed naturally as people connected through education, profession, interests, relationships, and shared foundations. A soft network with no charter and no central authority, yet stronger than any administrative system because it operated where paperwork could not reach. Trust. By the late 19th and early 20th century, a wave of new organizations began taking shape, designed to reinforce the order the elite believed the world needed. Among them, two names stood out above the rest: the Rhodes Trust and the Round Table groups. The Rhodes Trust, founded by Cecil Rhodes, sought young people with leadership potential, bringing them to Oxford to cultivate a new generation of English-speaking leaders with a vision that extended beyond borders. The Round Table groups, semi-formal discussion circles, spread across Britain and its dominions, worked to shape a shared future for a world the British Empire was struggling to hold together. What made these groups unique was not secrecy, but their cross-border mindset. British, Canadian, Australian, and South African thinkers sat together, sharing concerns and responsibilities at a time when the world was entering unprecedented turbulence. Their goal was not to manipulate the globe, but to preserve stability amid the rapid forces of modernization. In the United States, the growing class of scholars, lawyers, and financiers, along with university societies like Skull and Bones, began to intersect with the ideas and structures of the Round Table, not to merge into some global super-secret society, as modern mythology often imagines, but simply because people who shared the same traits naturally gravitated toward one another. High education, strong ambition, wide networks, and similar challenges in an increasingly complex world. The New Age did not need conspiracies to produce networks, it only needed people. People who traveled more, learned more, communicated farther, and occupied increasingly intertwined roles. By the 1910s and 1920s, when the First World War erupted, that network began to reveal its true shape, not in candlelit secret meetings behind velvet curtains, but in dense exchanges among scholars, diplomats, merchants, journalists, and politicians, the educated elite of their time. They exchanged letters between London and New York. They met at international economic conferences. They shared data in an era when data itself was a luxury. They debated the future of a world trembling after the shock of war. And as these conversations repeated themselves for decades, they slowly formed a kind of soft alliance, misty and diffuse, yet broader and more enduring than any secret society that had ever existed. Some historians call it the international elite networks. Others call it the transnational leadership class. But whatever the name, the essence remains the same. This was the natural outcome of the era, not the execution of a hidden master plan. As the world industrialized, every line of power, from steel, banking, and trade to diplomacy and the press, was forced to coordinate across borders. None of these people were strong enough to control the world, yet none of them acted alone. They became nodes in a network so large that even they could not see its full shape. The early 20th century saw multiple streams converge: major universities, training leaders with overlapping ideologies of stability and cooperation, academic clubs and early think tanks debating trade, security, and international order, newspapers rising as a new force shaping public perception, the first multinational corporations emerging, demanding policies that extended beyond the nation-state. All of this made outsiders feel as though some invisible hand was guiding the world. But in truth, there was no hand, only a natural process. Influential people meeting one another, influencing one another, responding to the same global challenges and accidentally creating the impression that a single will was directing world affairs. The reality was far more complicated. The modern world did not revolve around one center of power, but around thousands of small centers, loosely connected by shared interests, relationships, and practical needs. Yet as that network became increasingly visible, a new question began to drift through the air of the 1930s, when that elite class confronted depression, fascism, and the threat of war. Would they still be able to hold the world's fragile order together? Or would they themselves be swept into the storm they once believed they could navigate? And what was meant to happen eventually did. When the First World War erupted, the things that once felt solid collapsed in just a matter of months. The elite networks that had once drifted quietly beneath the surface of society suddenly became strategic assets that governments were forced to call upon, not because they believed in conspiracies or shadowy secrets, but because modern warfare revealed a new truth. Weapons no longer existed only in steel and gunpowder. They also lived in the stories that were told, in the information spread at precisely the right moment, in the connections a nation could not build overnight by decree. As war cast its shadow across Europe, it became clear how those discreet circles, scholars, journalists, merchants, diplomats who had once known each other in their university years, turned into natural communication channels between nations. No conspiracy, no secret pact. These people were already connected, and those connections became bridges for passing information, sensing the mood, and understanding what was happening on the other side of the front. History did not ask them to change, it simply asked them to continue doing what they already knew how to do. Britain saw this need first. London established a soft propaganda bureau, not led by commanders barking orders, but by writers, historians, and people who understood how to shape a question so it gently persuaded the public without relying on lies. They did not create crude fabrications. They adjusted the light, shifted the angle, illuminated just enough for readers to lean naturally in their direction. Modern propaganda was born not from military strategy rooms, but from wooden desks stacked with papers and ink. At the same time, intelligence entered a new era. Spies were no longer only shadows slipping through alleys. They wore ordinary faces: reporters, professors, businessmen, archaeologists. They traveled between cities, spoke with locals, listened to details that seemed harmless but built a larger picture. The old secret societies, where discretion and reading between the lines had been cultivated for generations, accidentally became fertile ground for intelligence services to draw from. Not because secret societies wanted to join the war, but because the war came to them. A war needed people who knew how to stay silent. Then the First World War ended. The world believed it had escaped the darkness, yet what lay behind was a fragile quiet. Empires shaking, currencies falling, borders shifting, and peace treaties thin as thread. In that quiet, the elite networks were pulled again into the center of politics, not as an invisible force, but simply as human beings. People with knowledge, people with analysis, people with the calm that the era desperately needed. Between the wars, propaganda entered an entirely new age. Radio, newspapers, and documentary film made information move faster than any army. And strangely enough, the people behind those communication machines often came from the elite class itself, people who had once joined college societies, debated in closed clubs, and grown up in environments where caution was instinct. They were not plotting anything, they simply knew how to tell a story the public was ready to hear. When the Second World War broke out, the role of these networks matured in ways no one fully predicted. Britain summoned mathematicians from Cambridge to Bletchley Park to break codes. The United States gathered scholars from Yale, Harvard, and Princeton to build the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. They did not carry swords or rifles, but they understood that a map could reveal what eyes could not, that a meaningless cable might hide an entire military plan, that every truth carried its own shadow. And most importantly, they knew how to keep hidden what must remain hidden. During those years, the old secret societies almost dissolved, melting into a new shape. No rituals, no symbols, no mystical stories. War pulled every talent into practicality. The people molded in elite environments where discretion, logic, and discipline were second nature became essential pieces of the machinery of strategy, intelligence, and information. There was no secret organization directing the war, but there were countless lines of connection that the public never saw. Lines of education, friendship, scholarship, conversations that began when these individuals were still students. Those lines taught governments something crucial. Sometimes the strongest weapon is not the army, but the ability to anticipate. World War became the place where the old secret societies transformed. They no longer survived as organizations, but as a type of person, someone who listened carefully, gathered quietly, observed constantly, disappeared at the right moment, and appeared when needed. A kind of person the 20th century would rely on, yet also one it would eventually have to confront in the uneasy calm of peacetime. When the world wars finally closed, the world did not grow lighter. It simply changed shape. The sound of bombs had faded, but the footsteps echoing through the corridors of power were louder than ever. nations suddenly realized something they had only sensed faintly during the years of conflict. Power in the new age would no longer be measured by the land you conquered or the number of guns you stored in your arsenals. It lived in something far more fragile: the speed with which you grasped information, the ability to understand your opponent before they understood themselves, and the art of reading what lay beneath every layer of language. And as if history were continuing its own logic, the people who had served quietly within the wartime networks, scholars who could read a map like a paragraph, analysts who could weigh every shift, diplomats who understood the weight of silence, journalists who knew which question mattered most, stepped into the center of a new kind of secret society, the modern intelligence agencies. No rituals, no symbols, no medieval oaths. The secret society of this era worked with data, code, 100-page reports, cables only a few words long, and analyses that could redirect national policy. In the United States, the CIA was born in 1947 as the successor to the wartime OSS, a service built far more on writing, historical research, and language analysis than on force of arms. In its earliest days, the CIA did not look anything like the dramatic version in films. It resembled a vast intellectual forum where freshly graduated Ivy League students sat beside linguists, philosophers, and historians trying to answer the century's largest question: where was the post-war world heading? The secrecy of the CIA was not the secrecy of ritual, but the secrecy of analysis. Streams of data that could not be released, assessments where even the smallest miscalculation could carry a devastating price. Across the ocean, MI6, the British intelligence service that had lived in the shadows for generations, also had to transform. The war had taught them that the enemy was no longer just an army visible on a map, but a set of invisible forces: extremism, revolution, economic pressure, and above all, the fiery tension between two rising superpowers. MI6 had long recruited from Oxford and Cambridge, places where discretion was almost a natural instinct. Now it had to adapt to a world flooded with information. The age of letters buried under stones was over. The age of encrypted machines, wiretaps, and data analysis had begun. MI6 became an unusual bridge between the old imperial mindset and the electrified rhythm of the new era. But the world could not remain balanced if only one side learned to use the shadows. In the Soviet Union, the KGB emerged as something different, yet built on the same underlying logic. If the CIA was grounded in networks of knowledge and MI6 in imperial legacy, the KGB was grounded in ideology. They needed no rituals, ideology was the ritual. They needed no symbols, the state itself was the symbol. In that world, secrecy was not an exception, it was the foundation. The KGB did not only watch enemies abroad, it monitored every small vibration inside Soviet society. If in the West secret membership was a choice, then in the Soviet Union the secret society was the nation itself. Different in method, the CIA, MI6, and KGB shared a single understanding that only the modern age could produce. The world after 1945 was a world of information, and information functioned like a modern ritual, something only the authorized were allowed to touch. It was people, not institutions, who became the true bridges between these centers of power. They understood that one missed signal could tilt the entire global board, that one flawed assessment could bend the arc of a decade, that the wars of the future would not be fought through divisions of troops, but through the ability to see what no one else saw. The deeper we move into this era, the clearer one truth becomes. The traditional secret society did not vanish. It simply changed form, from rituals and symbols to data and analysis, from stone-walled basements to conference rooms lit by cold fluorescent lights, from ancient vows to documents stamped with the words "top secret." The essence remained: The world was held up by people who knew what could not be spoken and spoke only what could not be shared openly. And it was at this moment that a new question began to flicker, one the 20th century would wrestle with for decades. When the secret society becomes a network of information, who truly holds the power? The one who keeps the secrets, or the one who decides what counts as a secret? As the early years of the post-war era slipped into the past, the world suddenly split into two distinct halves, like a mirror cracked down its center. One side believed in freedom, the other in collectivism. One trusted the market, the other trusted planning. One opened its doors, the other sealed them shut. And yet, in a twist of irony, this divide forced both sides to rely on the same kind of resource. Minds capable of seeing farther than any government's line of sight, reading what military maps could never show, and predicting the next move before the opponent even breathed. The Cold War did not erupt with the roar of cannons, but with an atmosphere of fear, a fear that spread like mist, invisible yet everywhere. In that taut space, stretched like a violin string, strategic research groups, once quiet intellectual clubs, suddenly became the silent control rooms of the world. Not weapon laboratories, but laboratories of the future, where scenarios were built not to defeat the enemy, but to keep humanity from stepping past a point of no return. Rand Corporation in the United States was the clearest example. They gathered people the battlefield would never recognize: mathematicians, philosophers, physicists, psychologists, engineers, people without military rank, yet capable of drawing models that generals sat down to hear. They did not count ammunition, they counted risks. They did not plan attacks, they planned how to ensure an attack would never happen. From rooms without flags or insignias, the concept of nuclear deterrence was born, one of the strangest ideas humanity has ever devised to keep itself away from the edge. There were no rituals, no symbols, no vows like the Templars or the Masons. But there was another kind of darkness, the darkness of arguments that could never appear in newspapers, of scenarios that, if released, would shake an entire society, of numbers written only to be locked in steel safes for decades. In Europe, Chatham House and the Bilderberg Group played similar roles, but in a distinctly European way: quiet, understated, blending diplomacy with dialogue. Leaders, business figures, and scholars met in unrecorded rooms to discuss the path the West should take. Not to dominate the world, an idea far too simple, but to keep it standing when even a slight miscalculation could send it trembling. On the far side of the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union created institutions with similar functions, though with a completely different spirit. Their strategic research institutes operated in a space where ideology was the backbone. Analysts were expected not only to understand the West, but to protect an entire worldview built like a fortress around the nation. In that environment, silence became instinct. Every conclusion had to be so cautious, it sometimes felt like they were writing not for leaders in the Kremlin, but for generations not yet born. The Cold War transformed think tanks, research institutes, and analytical groups into the quiet heart of global power. Governments could change, elections could shift the landscape, but behind the scenes, private discussions, theoretical frameworks, and nameless forecasts continued to flow like underground currents, keeping the world's ship from drifting too close to the cliff. And this discretion bred public suspicion. People saw the unfilmed meetings, the figures who rarely appeared in public, the decisions shaped in rooms they could not enter. But 20th century politics was too complex to be explained under bright lights. Many questions could not be asked openly, and many answers could not be spoken aloud, not because of conspiracy, but because the world had become too fragile. It is strange. Throughout 3 tense decades, these organizations, though not secret societies in the traditional sense, functioned almost exactly like the ancient ones. They guarded knowledge, analyzed it, shielded it from public panic, and in their own way kept the world from falling into the abyss. And then the walls came down, flags changed, borders once thought immovable turned thin as fog. But as the Cold War ended, a new truth surfaced. The world had entered an age where borders blurred, ideologies faded, and information, for the first time in history, became the most valuable asset on Earth. And from that moment, the secret society of the 21st century began to take shape, not in closed rooms, but in data streams crossing continents, in invisible algorithms, in networks with no faces at all. As the world moved toward the end of the 20th century, a quiet truth began to surface. The old secret societies had not disappeared. They had simply become harder to recognize. There were no more candles flickering in stone chambers, no more oaths whispered in the dark, no more small groups placing their hands on mystical symbols to decide the fate of thousands. But the silent influence remained. It had only changed shape, shifting from ritual to structure, from symbols to systems, from visible organizations to invisible financial and academic networks that stretched across the modern world. In an age of industrial capitalism and expanding global finance, power no longer belonged to the person wearing a cloak or guarding ancient rites. It belonged to those who understood how capital moved, how markets behaved, who could coordinate investment funds, banks, corporations, and cross-border economic institutions. As traditional secret societies faded from relevance, a new kind of secret society emerged, not based on mysticism, but on knowledge, not built on ritual, but on expertise, not hidden by secrecy, but protected by a complexity the public could not easily penetrate. Names like Rockefeller, Morgan, and Rhodes appear again and again in modern stories, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes tied to theories that have no basis in fact. But when we strip away the fog of myth surrounding them, one truth becomes clear. They did not control the world through conspiracy, but through systems. Systems that arose not from ancient secrets, but from the conditions of their time, an era when governments were weak, markets unstable, and those who understood finance were the very people society had to rely on. Morgan is the clearest example. When the United States in the early 20th century faced a financial crisis with no government agency strong enough to intervene, J.P. Morgan became the last stabilizer. Outsiders saw overwhelming personal power, but in reality it was simply the vacuum of the era, a world where the state was still young and the market needed a steady mind to keep order before everything tipped into chaos. Rockefeller created a different model of power, not a secret society, but a network. Universities, private foundations, research institutes, hospitals, and scientific and social organizations. People looked at the continuity of this system and assumed some hidden design must be guiding it. But continuity is not mystery. It is the result of multiple generations managing the same long-term vision. When a structure is built well enough, it gives the illusion of an invisible hand, even when it is only discipline and organization. Rhodes was a unique case. He did not build a secret society. He built an ecosystem for selecting future leaders. The Rhodes Scholarship carried no hidden rituals. It was simply a mechanism to bring bright young minds from around the world to Oxford, where they would debate, collide, and share values. When they later entered politics, science, or journalism, they brought with them the intellectual intersections they had formed together. Outsiders call that covert influence. But in truth, it is just the power of education and shared environment. And this is the spirit of the 20th century. Secret societies did not disappear. They blended into social structures. People with similar backgrounds, similar values, similar professional habits continued to encounter each other in academic, economic, and political spaces. They needed no oath, they only needed familiarity, trust, and the repetition of patterns. When generations walk through the same door, people looking from the outside see that continuity and call it secret. But in reality, it is just the inertia of structure. As the world grew more complex, economies interlinked in webs so delicate that a shock in Asia could shake markets in Europe or the United States, no single government could understand everything on its own. They relied on policy institutes, research centers, and private foundations, organizations that could not make every discussion public, not because they were forbidden, but because the information was too dense, too sensitive, too easily misinterpreted under the glare of public attention. From this, discrete institutions emerged, not to manipulate the world, but to prevent it from collapsing under its own weight. They worked through reports, strategic analyses, meetings that could not be broadcast live, and because this quiet was necessary, the public began to project onto them the aura of secret societies, even though they had no rituals beyond keeping silent until the time was right. And this reveals one of the strange paradoxes of the financial industrial age. Hidden power does not sit in ritual, it sits on desks. It does not live in symbols, it lives in spreadsheets and economic models. It does not dwell within ancient stone walls, but in meetings between businesses, scholars, and governments. Rockefeller or Morgan did not hide power. They simply lived inside a world of complexity, where every decision had to be weighed carefully before stepping into the public light. As the world stepped out of the early decades of the Cold War, it began to operate like a vast machine powered by both light and shadow. People came to understand that the public sphere was only a stage, the place of media appearances, ceremonial handshakes, speeches polished word by word. But behind that bright surface, there was always another space, quieter and more discreet, where real conversations happened, where no one had to worry about image or slogans, where ideas could speak in their truest voice. Amid the ideological standoff between two global poles, nations slowly realized they needed something simple but essential, a place where the people who actually shaped the world could talk to one another without having to talk to the entire world at the same time. And in that mindset, Bilderberg emerged. In 1954, at a small hotel called the Hotel de Bilderberg in Oosterbeek, the Netherlands, an unassuming place one would never imagine becoming the center of so much later speculation, a meeting took place between influential figures from the United States and Europe. Their purpose was not to create a secret organization, nor to script the future of humanity. They simply wanted to address a growing fear, the rising distrust between the two sides of the Atlantic, a tension that could fracture the Western alliance at a time when even the smallest crack could shift the balance of the world. The meeting revolved around one seemingly simple question: how can we understand one another before misunderstandings turn into crisis? But the silence around the meeting became the material from which time wove stories far larger than reality. No press, no cameras, no detailed public statements. Only one rule: everyone was free to speak truthfully, as long as nothing was quoted outside the room. The more discreet it was, the more the public imagined. And as in every era, silence is the most fertile soil for speculation to grow. In truth, Bilderberg resembles no secret society in history, no rituals, no symbols, no oaths, no shared ideology. It is closer to a round table than a brotherhood, where politicians sit beside scholars, where business leaders talk with journalists, where each person brings a fragment of the world as they see it from their own vantage point. It is a space where honesty can exist precisely because no spotlight is shining directly into it. That is what makes the public both curious and uneasy. In an age overflowing with information, any empty space becomes a canvas for fear to take shape. When influential people gather behind closed doors, it is easy to assume something is being hidden. Those inside believe they are trying to keep the world steady. Those outside often believe they are creating instability. And yet Bilderberg issues no resolutions, holds no enforcement power, and compels no nation to act. It does not have a budget to run the world. What it creates is simply a quiet space, a rare clearing where people who normally live beneath the lightning bolts of media scrutiny, election pressure, market swings, and geopolitical storms can understand one another before misunderstanding becomes fracture. Over more than half a century, the subjects discussed have changed with the pulse of the world: economics, energy, war, technology, climate, social unrest. But the spirit of the meetings has remained the same, an attempt to find clarity amid increasingly turbulent currents. What turns Bilderberg into legend is the same force that once distorted the Templars, the Illuminati, and the Freemasons. Humanity fears what it cannot see. When the eye cannot pierce the wall, the imagination fills the void with shapes more elaborate than truth. And with time, those shapes become rumor. If we slow down and look carefully, Bilderberg is not the command center of the world. It is simply one of the few communication mechanisms the modern era still allows, a space where politics, economics, media, and academia can meet in a way the public arena can no longer sustain. In a world divided by ideology, elections, and information overload, sometimes a quiet meeting is the only thing that keeps people talking instead of fighting. And through the great upheavals of the 20th century, a quiet truth emerged. Bilderberg stands behind none of the world's earthquakes. It merely stands beside them, like a silent witness, a place where those trying to understand the world can briefly speak in their real voices. When we look across the long arc of thousands of years, it's easy to assume that secret societies are creations of darkness, products of ambition, hidden agendas, and the shadowy forces behind history's most unusual turns. But if we step back and look at humanity through the lens of anthropology, the science that seeks essence rather than events, we discover almost the opposite. Secret societies are not exceptions. They are part of our nature. Because what we call a secret society is really just an amplified version of a very ancient human need, the need to belong to a small circle, a place where we feel safer against the vastness of the world, a place where we can say things that cannot be shouted across a public square, a place where trust becomes the air that ideas breathe. Before nations existed, before religions took shape, even before writing appeared, humans lived inside such circles, tight-knit groups where knowledge was passed through whispers, shared experiences, and the silent understanding in each other's eyes. Anthropology calls this the intimate circle. History calls it the inner group. Popular culture calls it the secret society. The difference often lies only in the light we choose to cast on it. In the age of hunters and gatherers, those who understood the sky, who could read tracks in the soil, who carried the stories of ancestors, who could lead a group across unfamiliar plains, these people were placed in selective circles. Not everyone was allowed to hear every story, because in early societies, knowledge was a treasure that needed protection from chaos. Rituals, coded language, and traditions were not created to hide the truth, but to preserve its meaning, to keep wisdom from dissolving in the hands of those not yet ready to carry it. As humanity moved through agriculture, kingdoms, and the first ancient cities, we changed our tools, our languages, our architecture, but we did not change the habit of gathering in small circles, and that habit produced the secret groups of every era: Egyptian priests, the clay tablet scribes of Mesopotamia, Greek thinkers meeting beneath trees, the medieval stoneworkers of Europe, the university societies of America, the think tanks and strategy groups of the 20th century, and even the quiet online communities of the internet age. The form shifts, but the impulse remains. Humans gather in small groups to understand the larger world. And here is the striking truth. Secret societies do not exist purely for power, they also exist for meaning. A closed circle always carries the feeling of holding a special piece of knowledge, not to control the world, but to understand it in ways the crowd cannot. Some questions can only be asked in small rooms. Some truths can only survive in the company of people who share the same quiet doubts. From an anthropological view, a secret society is a kind of social spiritual space, a place where people are allowed to question, to venture deeper, to rebuild the foundations of thought in ways that society outside is not yet ready to accept. This is why secret societies never disappear. They only change shape depending on the era. The more complex society becomes, the more humans need small circles to anchor themselves. The more information floods our lives, the more we need quiet spaces to think. The more the digital world pulls us in every direction, the more we crave belonging, a place that knows us, and a place we know in return. And so the secret society of the modern age no longer uses ritual or esoteric codes. It might be a research group where a handful of scientists discuss ideas the world is not yet ready to confront. It might be a team of engineers designing algorithms that will influence how billions see the world. It might be a small conference room in a tech corporation where decisions about the future of data are made in silence. It might be a team of economic analysts whose names the public will never know. The closed spaces of today do not carry the shadows of the ancient past. They carry the necessity of complexity. When the world becomes too big, we need small places. When truth becomes too layered, we need closed conversations. When society grows too loud, we need silence. A secret society at its deepest level is not a structure of mystery, but a structure of survival. It is the mechanism humans use to keep their minds from being swept away by systems too vast for any individual to comprehend. And whenever the world enters crisis, war, recession, pandemic, or waves of uncertainty that shake our sense of direction, people quietly return to their circles, as though returning to the oldest instinct we have ever known.